He stood at the altar like a man carved from silence. His eyes were closed, his hands were still, and the entire church, filled with the wealthiest families in the city, held its breath. Because outside those carved wooden doors, his mother was screaming, "Run, girl, run while you still can. You do not know what you are walking into." The poor girl Grace stood at the entrance of that grand church in a simple white dress borrowed from her neighbor. She had no flowers. She had no shoes that matched. She had walked 2 miles in the rain to get there. And she did not run. She walked forward. The billionaire's mother collapsed against a pillar, weeping. The guests turned and whispered. The priest cleared his throat nervously, and the man at the altar, Daniel, finally opened his eyes. He looked at Grace the way a man who has been lost in the dark looks at a single candle. And this is where our story truly begins. Before we continue, dear friend, please like this video and subscribe to African so you never miss a story like this one. To understand what happened in that church, you must first understand the man standing at the altar. Daniel Assay was 34 years old and worth more money than most people could count in a lifetime. His family owned AC Holdings, a company that stretched its fingers into oil, real estate, and telecommunications across 5 countries. He lived on the top floor of a glass tower in the city, in a penthouse where the floors were marble and the windows touched the sky. He drove a black car that most people had only ever seen in magazines. He wore suits that cost more than 3 months of Grace's salary. But wealth is a heavy coat, and Daniel had been wearing it since childhood. His father, Emmanuel Assay, had died when Daniel was 19 years old. Not slowly, not peacefully, but suddenly. In the middle of a board meeting, with his hand pressed to his chest and his eyes wide open, as if he had seen something coming that he could not stop. Daniel had been the one to find him. He had walked into that boardroom to bring his father a cup of tea, and he had found a room full of executives standing silently around a man on the floor. After that day, Daniel changed. He became quiet, reserved. He moved through the world as if he were behind glass, seeing everything, touching nothing. He took over the company. He made it bigger. He gave generously to charities that bore no public recognition. But he never laughed. He never celebrated. He was alive. Yes, but he was not quite living. His mother, Victoria Assay, watched her son become a ghost, wearing expensive clothes. She was a formidable woman, tall, sharp-eyed, draped always in silk and pearls. She had grown up poor, fought her way into wealth through marriage and sheer will, and she had sworn that her children would never suffer the indignities she had suffered. She managed Daniel's social life, his public image, and his relationships with the precision of a general managing a war. She had selected 3 suitable women for Daniel over the years. Educated women, beautiful women, women from good families with good names. Daniel had looked at all of them and felt nothing. Now we must speak of Grace. Grace Mensah lived in a part of the city that Victoria Assay had never visited and never would. She rented a room, not an apartment, a room in a house she shared with 4 other families. The walls were thin. In the mornings, she could hear her neighbor's baby crying, and the sound felt like company rather than intrusion. She worked 2 jobs. By day, she cleaned the offices of a law firm in the city center, moving quietly between glass desks with a mop and a bucket. By evening, she sold boiled groundnuts from a small pot outside the market, wrapping them in newspaper cones for people hurrying home. Grace had grown up in a village for hours from the city. She had come here at 22 to care for her sick mother, who needed medicine that only the city hospitals could provide. Her mother had recovered, but Grace had stayed because there was nothing left at home but an empty house and a memory of better times. She was 27 now. She had a smile that arrived, slowly and stayed long, the kind of smile that comes from a person who has learned to find warmth in small things. She was kind to people who had nothing to give her in return. She shared her groundnuts with the street children who gathered near her pot each evening, even when it cut into her small profit. The first time Daniel saw her, he was not supposed to be there at all. It was a Thursday evening, and Daniel's driver had taken a wrong turn. The black car moved slowly down a street it had no business, being on a narrow road lined with evening vendors, the air thick with the smell of roasted corn and rain-wet earth. Daniel sat in the back seat, his face turned to the window, his mind still running the numbers from a meeting he had just left. Then the car stopped at a traffic light, and through the window he saw her. Grace was crouching beside her small pot, blowing on the coals to keep them alive. The wind kept killing her fire. She would blow, the coals would glow orange, and then the wind would sweep across and they would dim again. She did not curse it. She did not stand up and walk away. She simply waited, and then she blew again. Patiently, steadily, with a kind of quiet dignity that held Daniel's attention the way nothing had held it in years. Small boy ran up to her, no shoes, his shirt torn at the shoulder, and he pointed at the pot hopefully. Grace looked into the pot. She looked into her small money box. She looked at the boy. Then she took a full newspaper cone of ground nuts and pressed it into his hands. The boy ran away without saying thank you. Grace watched him go and smiled anyway. The traffic light changed. The car moved forward. Daniel said nothing to his driver, but he turned and watched through the rear window until the street curved, and she disappeared from sight. He came back the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, he did not approach her. He sat in the back of his car and watched from a distance, feeling something he had not felt in 15 years. The faint, stubborn flicker of wanting to be near a person, not to acquire them, not to impress them, just to be near them. On the fourth Thursday, he got out of the car. He walked to her pot and stood there awkwardly in his expensive suit, and he said the most ordinary thing in the world. How much for one cone? Grace looked up at him. She took in the suit, the car, the discomfort on his face, and she said, without missing a beat, "But I can see you are not from around here, so I will not overcharge you." It was a small laugh, rusty, like a door that had not been opened in a long time, but it was real. "You could overcharge me," he said. "I would not even know." "I would know," she said, and handed him his cone. That was the beginning. They talked every Thursday for 6 months. He never told her his full name. She never asked why a man in a suit, worth more than her monthly rent, came to buy groundnuts from a street vendor. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, the traffic, a story she had heard from a neighbor, something he had read in a book. He began to look forward to Thursdays the way a man in the desert looks forward to shade. It was on a cold Thursday in December that he finally told her his full name. "Daniel Osei?" she repeated, testing the weight of it. "The ASA Holdings." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, tense aside. "Does that change anything?" He looked at her. "I hope not." "Then it doesn't." He asked her to marry him 4 months later, not in a restaurant, not with a photographer, not with a ring that could have purchased her entire neighborhood. He came to her small room, sat on the plastic chair beside her window, and said, "Grace, I want to spend whatever life I have left being near someone who makes me feel like living again." "I think that person is you," Grace cried. "Not from joy. Exactly. From the weight of being seen." She said yes. That was when the trouble began. Victoria Osei received the news the way a person receives the news of a natural disaster, with complete disbelief, followed by cold, controlled fury. "You are marrying a groundnut seller," she said, not raising her voice, which was somehow worse than if she had screamed. "I am marrying Grace," Daniel said. "You are not yourself," Victoria sighed. "You have not been yourself since your father died." "I understand that. But this," she gestured at nothing. "At everything. This is not love. This is grief, looking for a place to hide." "You have never met her," Daniel said. "I do not need to meet her." What Victoria said next, Daniel would only understand much later, when the truth finally surfaced, like something that had been underwater for a very long time. She said, "Daniel, There are things about this family that you do not know. If you bring this girl into our lives, those things will find their way to the surface. And when they do, everyone will suffer, including her." Daniel stared at his mother. "What things?" he asked. Victoria's jaw tightened. "Trust your mother," she said, "for once in your life. Trust your mother, and let this go." He did not let it go, and something in Victoria's eyes, a shadow, a flicker of something that looked almost like fear, followed him out of the room and into his car and all the way home. What was she hiding? Daniel was not a man who ignored shadows. In business, he had built his company's empire by looking exactly at the things other people looked away from: the uncomfortable numbers, the awkward questions, the uncomfortable truths buried beneath polished reports. His father had taught him that. Before Ediad, Daniel sat in his study that night, the city glowing 40 floors below him, and he thought about his father. Emmanuel Osai had died of a heart attack. That was what everyone said. That was what the death certificate said. That was what the newspapers said. That was what Victoria had told him. Re-died and composed, standing in the corridor of the hospital while Daniel stared at the wall and tried to understand how a room could be different when a person was no longer in it. He had accepted it, because grief does not leave room for questions. But now, 15 years later, his mother's voice came back to him. "There are things about this family that you do not know." He opened his laptop. He did not know what he was looking for. He began reading everything he could find about his father's death. Old newspaper archives, business reports from that year, anything that had been written about Emmanuel Osei in the months before he died. For 3 hours, he found nothing unusual. Then he found one article, a small piece from a financial newspaper published 2 months before his father's death. It reported that Osei Holdings had been under investigation by the financial regulator for irregularities in its accounts. Daniel read the article twice. He had never known about this investigation. It checked the company's historical records, the ones he had inherited, the ones he had always trusted, the ones that had been organized and annotated by Victoria herself in the years following his father's death. The investigation was not mentioned anywhere. He called his most trusted lawyer, a man named Frederick. The next morning, "Frederick," he said without greeting, "I need you to pull the financial regulatory records for ESA Holdings from 20 years ago. Anything related to an investigation." A pause. "Daniel, that's a long time ago." No. "Can you do it?" Can. "But why now?" "I will explain later." Frederick called back in 4 days. When he did, his voice was careful, the voice of a man choosing his words the way you choose your steps on uncertain ground. "Daniel, I found the records." There was indeed an investigation. It was closed 6 weeks after it opened, with no formal findings. Why was it closed so quickly? That's what's interesting. A pause. The investigation was closed because a key witness withdrew their testimony. The witness was the company's chief financial officer at the time, a man named Joseph Mensah. The name landed in Daniel's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Mensah. Gray's last name was Mensah. He did not say anything for a long moment. His hand on the phone felt very far away. "Daniel," Frederick's voice came through the speaker. "Are you still there?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Send me everything." He sat in his study for the rest of that evening, reading every document Frederick sent. The picture they assembled was incomplete. Fragments of a story told partly in silence, but even in fragments it was disturbing. Joseph Mensah had been the CFO of Osei Holdings 20 years ago. He had discovered financial irregularities in the company. Money that had been moved, accounts that did not reconcile, numbers that told a story that the official records denied. He had brought his findings to the board. He had begun the process of a formal report. Then, 6 weeks later, he had withdrawn. He had resigned from the company. He had left the city. 2 months after that, Emmanuel Osei, died of a sudden heart attack. And 6 months after that, Victoria Osei had restructured the company's accounts entirely, bringing in new auditors, new systems, new staff. Every trace of the old financial structure had been professionally, completely, and permanently erased. Daniel's hands were shaking when he put the papers down. He did not sleep that night. In the morning, he drove to the village where Grace had grown up. He told her he wanted to meet her family, that he wanted to see where she came from. Grace was delighted. She had been wanting this. She sat beside him in the car and told him stories about her village the whole way, her voice warm and unself-conscious, her hands moving as she spoke. He listened. He smiled when he was supposed to smile, and the whole time, behind his eyes, the documents were turning over and over. The village was small and green, gathered around a central well. Children ran between houses. Chickens moved in the dust. An old woman with a bright cloth wrapped around her head sat outside a modest house, shelling beans into a bowl. She looked up when the car stopped. Grace's mother, Ruth Mensa. She had kind eyes and work-rough hands, and the same slow smile her daughter had. She took Daniel's hand in both of hers and said, "So you are the man my daughter calls serious." Daniel smiled. He sat with her. He drank the tea she brought. And then, gently, carefully, watching Grace inside the house, helping her younger sister with something, he said, "Mrs. Mensa, your late husband worked for Osei Holdings, didn't he?" Ruth's hands went still on her bowl of beans. She looked at him. Her eyes, which had been warm, became very careful. "Who told you that?" she asked quietly. "I found some records," Daniel said. "I am not here to cause trouble. I want to understand what happened." Ruth was quiet for a long time. The sound of Grace's laughter came from inside the house. Bright and unsuspecting Tenroot sighed. "Your father was a good man. I always believed that. He did not know what was being done in his name, but someone else did." She looked at Daniel very directly. "My husband found the money that was being hidden. He brought his evidence to the board, and then a woman came to our house. A tall woman, very well dressed, very polite, and she told my husband that if he continued, he would lose his job. She said he would be blacklisted from every company in the country. She said the evidence he had found was being misinterpreted. She said he was confused." Another pause. "She offered him money to go away, quietly, and he refused." Daniel asked. "He refused," Ruth said, "so they made it happen. Anyway, they buried his testimony. They ruined his name in financial circles. My husband could never find work in his profession again. He worked the land. She swallowed. He died of a broken spirit. That is what I believe." "The woman," Daniel said, though he already knew. "Can you describe her?" Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "She had pearls around her neck," Ruth said. "She always had pearls." The silence between them was complete. Then Grace came out of the house with her sister, laughing, calling to her mother, and Ruth's face arranged itself into something warm and ordinary. And Daniel sat there in the afternoon sun with a truth inside him that weighed more than anything he had ever carried. He almost let it go. Driving back to the city, with Grace asleep beside him, her head tilted against the window, her face peaceful, he thought. This does not have to surface. The investigation was 20 years ago. His father was gone. Joseph Mensa was gone. The money, whatever had been done with it, had long since been absorbed into the world. He could protect Grace from knowing that the man she was marrying came from the same family that had destroyed her. Father.E could simply love her and let the past rest. But then he thought of Ruth's hands going still on the bowl of beans. He thought of Grace selling groundnuts in the rain, working 2 jobs to pay her mother's hospital bills, sharing what little she had with a barefoot child who did not even say thank you. He thought of Joseph Mensa, a principled man, ground down to nothing for refusing to betray what he knew was right. And he thought of the woman with the pearls, sitting in his kitchen every Sunday morning, drinking tea, rearranging his life, and waiting, perhaps waiting, to see how long it would take before he stopped asking questions. He went to his father's oldest friend, a man named Augustus, who had known Emmanuel Osei since childhood and who had retired now to a quiet house by the sea. Augustus opened the door and looked at Daniel's face and said, "You found something?" It was not a question. Daniel told him everything. Augustus listened without interrupting, standing in his doorway, his arms folded, his face becoming very still. When Daniel finished, Augustus was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Your father knew about Joseph Amensa." Daniel stared. He did not know about the money. "Not at first, but when the investigation was opened, your father came to me. He was troubled. He said there were irregularities in accounts that he did not recognize. He said he was going to investigate personally." Augustus paused. Then, 3 weeks later, he told me he had been mistaken, that everything was in order, that he had overreacted. "What changed in those 3 weeks?" Daniel asked. Augustus looked at him with the eyes of a man who has been waiting to say something for 15 years. "I think you already know," he said. The full shape of it settled into Daniel's understanding that night, alone in his penthouse, with the city lights spread below him like an indifferent audience. The money, the hidden accounts, the investigation that was strung lad before it could breathe, the CFO who was silenced and destroyed, his father, whose sudden concern had been just as suddenly resolved. His father's death 2 months later ruled a heart attack, accepted by everyone because Emmanuel Osei had been a large man who worked too hard and slept too little. And through all of it, in the background, always managing, always arranging, always controlling Victoria Osei, her pearls and her silk and her iron will, and her absolute conviction that she had done what was necessary to protect the family she had clawed her way into. Had she silenced his father, too? The thought arrived fully formed and would not leave. He picked up his phone. He called. "Frederick, I need to know," Daniel said, "if it is possible to reopen a closed financial investigation from 20 years ago, and I need to know if there was ever a private medical inquiry into my father's death." A silence on the line. "Daniel," Frederick said carefully, "are you sure you want to open this?" "I was sure the moment I asked," Daniel said. He confronted his mother on a Sunday. He chose Sunday because Sunday was the day. Victoria always came to his penthouse for breakfast, a ritual she had maintained since he moved in, a tradition that felt like love and functioned, he now understood, like surveillance. She arrived at 9 in the morning, wearing blue silk, her pearls in place, carrying a box of pastries from the bakery she liked. She kissed his cheek. She moved through his kitchen with the comfort of a woman who has always considered other people's spaces. Her Onda Daniel sat at the kitchen table and watched her. "You're quiet this morning," she said, pouring tea. "I have been reading," he said. She set the teapot down. "About what?" "About ASA Holdings. 20 years ago. About Joseph Mensa." The kitchen went completely silent. Victoria did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was arranged, controlled, composed, but in her eyes, for just 1/2 second, Daniel saw it. Fear. Fear, the kind that comes from knowing that something you buried is standing in the room with you. "I don't know what you think you've found," she said. "But don't," Daniel said quietly. She stopped. "Do not tell me I have misunderstood," he said. "Do not tell me the records are incomplete. Do not tell me I am grieving or confused or that I am a child who cannot understand what adults must do." His voice was steady. "I am asking you, directly, as your son. What did you do?" Victoria set her teacup down. She sat across from him. "I protected this family," she said. "You destroyed another one," Daniel said. "Joseph Mensa was going to take everything." Her voice sharpened. "Do you understand what that means? Everything your father built. Everything I worked for. Your inheritance." This family's name. He was going to reduce it to a scandal, a headline, a cautionary tale. And for what? 4 numbers on a page. For honesty, Daniel said. Honesty. She said the word the way one says. The name of someone. I grew up with nothing. Daniel. Nothing. I know what it means to have nothing, and I know what it costs to never go back to it. I did what I had to do. Did you silence my father? Daniel asked. The silence that followed was the longest of his life. Your father had a heart attack. Victoria sighed. Did you know he was beginning to suspect what you had done? A pause. Your father was never well. You know that. That is not an answer. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary Sunday way. Cars, people, birds crossing the gray sky. I have kept this family standing, she said to the glass. I have kept your name clean, and your accounts full, and your future safe. Everything you have because I made hard choices when your father could not. The woman I am marrying, Daniel said, is the daughter of the man you destroyed. Victoria turned. For the first time, something crossed her face that was not composure. I know, she said, barely above a whisper. Daniel stared at her. You knew, the words came out slowly. You knew who Grace was, since the beginning. Her last name? Victoria Said Mensa. I recognized it immediately. She straightened. That is why I warned you. I was not trying to hurt her. I was trying to protect everyone from what would happen when the truth came out. No, Daniel said, rising. His voice was no longer steady. It was quiet in the way that things are quiet before they break. You were trying to keep the truth buried. You were warning her away not to protect her, but to protect yourself. Daniel, you sat at this table every Sunday, and you knew that the woman I was going to marry had grown up in poverty, had worked 2 jobs, had watched her father die with a broken spirit because of you, and you said nothing. You did nothing. You've simply tried to frighten her away. Victoria's jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright. I did what mothers do, she said. I protected my son. You protected your secret, Daniel said, and you will answer for it. If this story is moving you, subscribe now. The ending will change how you see everything. Victoria's composure cracked then. Not fully, but enough. Enough to see the human being inside the armor. The scared woman who had grown up with nothing and had done monstrous things to ensure she never went back there. They will take everything, she said. They will take what was never honestly ours to begin with. Daniel Said. I will make sure of that. He walked out of his own kitchen, leaving his mother standing at the window with her pearls, and her silk, and the ruin of everything she had built on someone else's silence. The hardest thing Daniel had ever done was tell Grace. He did not do it immediately. He spent a week with Frederick and 2 independent auditors and a legal team, building the formal documentation of what Victoria Osei had done, the manipulation of the financial investigation, the silencing of Joseph Mensah, the destruction of a man's career and livelihood for the crime of knowing too much. He submitted the documentation to the Financial Regulatory Authority, submitted a separate request for a review of his father's death records, not because he was certain, but because he could not be uncertain. And then he drove to Grace's small room, in the house with thin walls, and he sat on the plastic chair beside her window, and he told her everything. Grace was quiet for a very long time. Through the thin wall, someone's baby was crying. Through the window, the street sounds of the city moved past motorbike engines. A woman calling to her child. Someone laughing. Grace's hands were in her lap. She was looking at the floor. My father, she said finally. Her voice was very low. He always said he had done the right thing, even when we had nothing. Grace, I did the right thing. And I believed him. But I also wondered why the right thing had cost us so much. I know. She looked up at Daniel. Her eyes were full of tears that had not yet fallen. He knew he was right, she said. He went to his grave, knowing. That is, she stopped, swallowed. That is something. Daniel reached across and took her hands. I am sorry, he said, for what my family did to yours. I am sorry that you had to come to this city and sell groundnuts in the rain, because a decision made before you were old enough to understand changed the direction of your whole life. I am sorry. Grace looked at him for a long moment. You did not do it, she said. My family did. You are not your family, she said. I chose you. A quiet man who came to buy groundnuts, and did not know what to say, and laughed like a door that had not been opened in years. She squeezed his hands. I chose you. The tears came, then Eris first, then his. They held each other in that small room, while the city moved outside and the walls let in every sound. And it was the most honest Daniel had felt since he was 19 years old and the world had first broken open around him. The formal findings came 6 weeks later. The Financial Regulatory Authority confirmed the original irregularities in Osei Holdings accounts and the improper closure of the investigation. Victoria Osei was formally charged with obstruction of justice and financial misconduct. A significant portion of the company's assets, money that had been accumulated through mechanisms that should never have been permitted, was ordered to be surrendered. The medical review of Emmanuel Osei's death found no evidence of foul play. His heart had simply given out a large man, a high-stress life, a genetic predisposition. Daniel wept when he read that report, not from grief, but from something closer to relief. His father had been a man with flaws and blind spots, but he had not been a victim of his own wife. That distinction mattered. Victoria did not fight the charges publicly. She retained lawyers. She negotiated. In the end, she accepted a formal caution, a significant financial penalty, and the permanent restructuring of ASA Holdings governance. A new board, independent auditors, transparent accounts. She lost her position as honorary chair of the company. She lost the trust of the social circles she had cultivated for 30 years. She did not lose her son. Daniel continued to call her once a week, on Sundays, by telephone. He did not go to breakfast. He did not pretend that what she had done was forgivable in the easy way. But because she was his mother, and because holding on to anger was its own kind of prison, and because he had watched too many people choose bitterness over wholeness. Grace came with him to his father's grave the day after the legal proceedings concluded. She placed a small bunch of wildflowers, yellow and white, the kind that grew in the field near her village, at the base of the headstone. Your son is a good man, she said quietly to the stone. I think you would have liked me. Daniel stood beside her with his hand in hers and said nothing. He did not need to. On the day of the wedding, a small ceremony, 20 people, a church in the neighborhood where Grace had grown up. The sun came through the windows in long gold bars that fell across the wooden pews. Like a blessing, Grace wore the white dress. She returned it the next day, washed and pressed, with a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for trusting me with something precious." She walked up the aisle alone. There was no one to give her away. But at the altar, Daniel was waiting. His eyes were open, a year passed. The city moved on, as cities do, indifferent to the private revolutions that take place inside its houses and hearts. Grace Osei, she had taken his name. She said, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to, was enrolled in a university business program, studying finance. It had been her dream since childhood, abandoned when the money ran out. It was no longer abandoned. She went to lectures in the mornings and came home in the evenings and spread her textbooks across the dining table that had once held nothing but marble and silence, and now held color and noise and the smell of the jollof. She was learning to make the way her mother made it, which was imperfectly but warmly. Ruth Mensa had come to live with them for a season, not permanently, because Ruth was a woman who belonged to her village and her garden and her morning routines. But for 3 months she stayed, and she filled the penthouse with the sounds of a real home, early morning prayers, the clink of teacups, the low murmur of a grandmother telling stories to no one in particular, just to keep the air company. She visited Joseph Mensa's grave with Daniel, just the two of them, on a quiet Tuesday morning, she placed her hand on the stone and said, "They know now. Everyone knows. You were right, my love." She was quiet for a moment. "It cost us everything. But you were right." Daniel stood beside her and felt the particular weight of a justice that arrives too late for the person it was meant for, and the particular grace of it arriving at all. Victoriose had moved to a smaller house. It was still a very good house. She would not have known how to live otherwise. But the grandeur was gone. The social engagements were sparse. She had more silence now than she had ever had in her life. She used some of it, it seemed, to think. On Grace's birthday, 6 months into the year, a package arrived at their door. No note. But the handwriting on the label was victorious, controlled, precise, unmistakable. Inside was a length of the finest kente cloth, woven in the colors of Grace's home region, and a pair of pearl earrings. Grace held the earrings for a long time. Then she put them on. "Pearls do not belong to the wrong they were worn by," she said. Daniel watched her at the mirror and thought, "This is what I almost lost. This exact person. This exact moment." Ase Holdings was restructured and smaller than it had been. But it was cleaner. Daniel ran it differently, now with transparency, with independent oversight, with a foundation that carried Joseph Mensah's name and gave scholarships to young people from communities like the ones Grace had grown up in. Every year, 15 young Ghanaians received full funding for university education, because that was the number of years Joseph Mensah had been gone. At the foundation's first awards ceremony, Grace stood at the podium and looked out at the young faces in the audience, hopeful, nervous, bright, and she said, "My father was a man who chose honesty when dishonesty would have been easier. He paid for that choice with everything he had. For a long time, I thought his story was a warning, that goodness is punished and silence is survival. But I no longer believe that. I believe his story is a seed. Seeds take a long time to become trees. But here we are." She looked out at the audience. "Here we are." And so the man who had everything finally understood what everything meant. It was not the penthouse or the company or the name in the newspapers. It was not the marble floors or the black car or the suit that cost more than 3 months of someone's hard work. It was this, a woman who sold groundnuts in the rain, who gave what she had to a barefoot child who did not say thank you, who walked up a church aisle in borrowed shoes, while a billionaire's mother screamed at her to run, and who walked forward anyway. Because love, true love, is not afraid of the truth. It is made of Italiano. Thank you, dear friend, for sitting with us for this story. If it touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to African Folktales and click the bell so you never miss a story. And when you are ready, our next story is waiting for you right here. We will see you there.